The wind doesn't just blow in the Frost-Bight, it screams, a jagged sound that claws at the stone walls of my cellar like a predator hungry for the last bit of warmth in my bones. They said no wolf could survive a single winter out here, but they didn't realize I was already hollowed out long before the first snow fell. My name is Elara, and 8 months ago, I was destined to be a Luna, until the man I loved called my kindness a spiritual sickness and cast me into this frozen hell to die. Every day is a battle of survival, a rhythmic struggle of gathering wood and melting ice, fueled by the memory of a pack that traded their hearts for iron. But tonight, the storm brought something different. A heavy, metallic thud echoed against my door, and when I pulled it open, I found a creature that shouldn't exist, a jet-black wolf of impossible size, his fur matted with frozen blood and a silver harpoon buried in his shoulder. I knew that opening my door meant letting the frost in, but leaving him meant letting a soul go out. Before we journey through the 7 nights that followed, nights that would eventually bring the Alpha King himself to my doorstep, I wanted to mention that crafting these long-form stories takes dozens of hours of dedicated writing. If you find yourself lost in this atmosphere, perhaps you'll consider joining our community. It's a quiet gesture that ensures these stories never have to stop. The transition from the biting cold of the present to the memory of that day is like a plunge into boiling water. In my mind's eye, the sky is no longer a bruised gray, it is the suffocating, triumphant gold of a summer peak afternoon. The air smells of pine resin and roasted meat, the sense of a pack at the height of its power. I can see the ceremonial circle, hundreds of wolves gathered in a ring of muscle and fur, their eyes fixed on the center of the clearing where I stood, trembling not from cold, but from a dawning horror. Beside me stood Silas. Back then, I looked at him and saw a hero, a man whose jaw was carved from granite and whose amber eyes promised protection. We were to be mated at sunset. I was to be his Luna, the mother of the pack. But the trial of the sharp tooth demanded a price I hadn't prepared to pay. At our feet lay a young Omega from a rival territory, a boy no older than 14 who had been caught scavenging for fallen apples near our border. He was malnourished, his ribs counting themselves against his skin, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it made my stomach turn. "Prove your strength, Elara," Silas whispered, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that usually soothed me. He pressed the hilt of a ceremonial obsidian blade into my palm. "The pack must see that their Luna has the stomach to do what is necessary. A leader protects her own by eliminating the threat. Strike, and let the blood seal our bond." I looked at the blade, then at the boy. There was no threat here. Only a child who was hungry. My fingers, which had spent the morning weaving healing poultices for our elders, refused to tighten around the hilt. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing in on me. I saw Silas's father, the current Alpha, watching with a predatory stillness. I looked back at Silas, searching for a flicker of the boy I had grown up with, the one who used to help me rescue fallen birds from the gutters after a storm. "He's just a child, Silas," I said, my voice cracking through the silence of the clearing. "There is no honor in this. True strength is knowing when to stay the blade." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The warmth of the sun seemed to vanish, replaced by a social frost that turned every friendly face into a mask of stone. Silas didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply reached out and pried the knife from my unresisting hand with a sneer that distorted his handsome features into something unrecognizable. "You are spiritually crippled, Elara," he announced, his voice booming so it reached the furthest ranks of the pack. He didn't just speak to me, he spoke over me, as if I had already ceased to exist. "A Luna who cannot kill is a liability. A pack led by a woman with a bleeding heart is a pack destined for the grave. You have the soul of a sheep, and I will not have my lineage diluted by your cowardice." He turned his back on me and walked toward Kelia. She had been waiting in the front row, her eyes gleaming with a sharp, ambitious hunger. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the circle, took the blade from Silas, and performed the task with a chilling, performative efficiency. The crowd roared in approval. It was a sound of bloodlust and betrayal that still echoes in my nightmares. Kelia stepped toward me, wiping a stray drop of blood from her cheek with a manicured nail. "Did you really think a king wanted a nursemaid for a wife?" she hissed, her laughter like the sound of breaking glass. "The Frost-Bight is the only place for things as soft as you. At least there, your tears will turn to ice before they can embarrass anyone else." On Silas's command, the guards stripped me of my ceremonial white cloak, leaving me in nothing but a thin tunic. They didn't even give me the mercy of an execution. They drove me to the edge of the permafrost, the border where the green grass gives way to the gray, eternal winter of the north, and told me that if I ever crossed back into Summer Peak territory, I would be hunted as a rogue. The memory shatters as my hands dip into a basin of lukewarm water. The contrast is a physical blow. The golden sun of the Packlands is gone, replaced by the flickering, orange glow of my hearth and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the beast on my floor. I am back in the cellar, and the soft hands Silas despised are currently slick with the dark, heavy blood of the black wolf. My fingers move with a steady, practiced grace as I use a clean cloth to dab at the jagged entry wound where the silver harpoon had been lodged. Every touch is a risk. If he wakes in a feral state, he could crush my skull with a single snap of his jaws. But I don't pull away. As I work, cleaning the matted fur and applying a paste of dried yarrow and numbing moss, I realize that Silas was right about one thing: I am different. But as I look at the massive creature who would have surely died in the snow without my weakness, I wonder if the pack's definition of strength was simply a lie they told themselves to justify their cruelty. Do you think kindness is a weakness in a leader, or is Silas just too blinded by power to see Elara's value? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The first 3 nights were a blurred cycle of steam, blood, and the smell of burnt herbs. The wolf's fever burned so hot I could feel it radiating through the cellar's stone floor. He was trapped in that agonizing liminal space where the body fights itself, his massive muscles twitching under a coat that felt like heated wire. I spent hours grinding frozen roots into pastes, my fingers raw from the cold and the friction, pressing damp cloths to his snout while the wind outside tried to shake the door off its hinges. The silence of the Frost-Bight is a heavy thing. It presses against your eardrums until you start to hear the ghosts of your own thoughts. To keep my sanity, I began to talk. At first, it was just instructions: stay still, drink this, but as the night stretched on, the wolf became my confessor. He was a captive audience, a mountain of shadow and pain that couldn't judge me or cast me out. I told him about the garden I used to keep in Summer Peak, the one Kelia had salted the day I was banished. I told him how the moon looked from the high ridges of the south, golden and fat, unlike the sliver of ice that hung over this wasteland. By the 4th night, the wolf's breathing finally leveled out, though he remained deep in a restorative coma. The stillness allowed me to go deeper. I sat by the hearth, watching the way the orange light caught the silver tips of his black fur. "They think I'm a coward," I whispered into the flickering shadows. "Silas, the pack, they think I stayed my hand because I was scared of the sight of blood. But that's the lie they needed to believe so they could sleep at night." I leaned my head against the cool stone of the wall, looking at the creature's scarred flank. I wasn't afraid to kill that Omega because I was weak. I was afraid of becoming like Silas. I saw the way his eyes lit up when he handed me that blade. It wasn't about justice or the pack. It was about the thrill of owning a life. If I had struck that boy, I would have been surrendering the only part of me that was actually mine. I would have died that day anyway, just in a different way. On the 5th night, a secondary infection set in. The wolf's heart rate spiked, a frantic drumming that I could feel even through the thick layers of his muscle. I didn't have any more medicine. I had only my own heat and the desperate hope of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by another living thing. By the 6th night, the great blizzard peaked. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture from my breath turned to frost on my eyelashes. Then, the unthinkable happened. My hearth, my only lifeline, sputtered and died. The wood I had scavenged was damp with ice, refusing to catch. The cellar turned into an icebox within minutes. I watched the wolf's chest, the rise and fall becoming shallower, slower. The cold was winning. I had a choice. I could stay in my human form and likely freeze to death by dawn, or I could use the only gift I had left. With a painful shudder, I shifted. It wasn't the majestic transformation of a high-ranking alpha, it was the quiet, humble change of an omega. My white wolf form was small, barely a third of the size of the black beast on the floor, but my fur was thick and built for heat retention. I crawled into the space between the wall and the giant wolf, pressing my small, warm body against the hollow of his neck. I tucked my nose into his thick black mane, my paws kneading into his fur as I tried to share every ounce of my metabolic fire with him. In the darkness of that freezing cellar, we were a study in contrasts, a tiny spark of white huddled against a vast mountain of black. I drifted into a dangerous, cold-induced sleep, my last thought being that if we died, at least we wouldn't die alone. The seventh night brought a strange, heavy stillness. The storm had passed. I woke up still in my wolf form, my chin resting on the black wolf's shoulder. The cellar was bathed in the pale, blue light of a winter moon reflecting off the snow outside. I felt a movement, a slight shift in the weight beneath me. I looked up. The wolf was awake. He didn't growl. He didn't move to snap at the small creature draped over his neck. Instead, he just watched me. His eyes weren't the yellow of a wild animal, they were a piercing, intelligent silver blue, like the heart of a glacier. There was a terrifying gravity in that gaze, a sense of ancient power that made my wolf instincts want to belly crawl in submission. He looked at me with an intensity that suggested he had heard every word I had whispered in the dark, every confession of my weakness and my shame. He watched me for a long, unblinking moment before I felt my own exhaustion pull me back into sleep. When the sun finally broke over the horizon on the 8th morning, the cellar was empty of the beast, leaving only the scent of ozone and the heavy weight of a destiny I couldn't yet see. Elara risked her life to keep a stranger warm. Would you have done the same, or is she being too reckless? The 8th morning broke with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. I woke on the cold stone floor, my limbs stiff from the night spent in my wolf form. The spot beside me, which had been occupied by a mountain of fur and heat for a week, was cold. I shifted back into my human skin, my breath hitching as I looked around the dim cellar. He was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the floor, only the heavy scent of ozone and pine needles that lingered in the stagnant air. I knelt where he had lain, my fingers brushing the stone until they caught on a single, coarse strand of jet black hair. That was all he had left me. I felt a sudden, sharp hollow opening in my chest, a sensation of abandonment more profound than the day Silas had cast me out. For 7 nights, I hadn't been alone. For 7 nights, I had a purpose that didn't involve my own survival. Now, the cellar felt twice as large and 10 times as cold. I saved you, I whispered to the empty room, the strand of hair clutched in my palm. And you didn't even say goodbye. I forced myself to stand, to move through the motions of survival. I reached for the small, ceramic jar on my shelf, the one that held my most precious possession. It was a dried primrose from my mother's garden in the south, the only piece of home that hadn't been stripped from me. I held it for a moment, letting the faded yellow petals ground me, before a new sound cut through the wind. It wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was the rhythmic thud of horses, the jingle of harness metal, and the sharp, jagged sound of human laughter. I climbed the stone steps and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The brightness of the sun on the fresh snow was blinding, but the figures standing in my clearing were unmistakable. 3 dozen wolves from the Summer Peak pack had arrived, accompanied by heavy wagons loaded with timber and stone. At the head of the group, mounted on a massive bay stallion, sat Silas. Beside him, draped in expensive furs that looked vulgar against the stark white landscape, was Kelia. "Well, look at this," Kelia called out, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "The cockroach actually survived the winter. I told you she was hardy, Silas. Like a weed." Silas dismounted, his boots crunching into the snow with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. He looked at my small, fortified cellar, the place I had bled and sweated to make habitable, with utter disdain. He didn't look at me as a person, but as an obstacle to be cleared. The border has shifted, Elara, Silas said, pulling a scroll from his belt. The High Council has granted Summerpeak the rights to the Frost-Bight ridges. We're building a watchtower here to secure the northern pass. This cellar is the perfect foundation for the main pylon. You can't, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees. This is neutral territory. I've spent months building this. It's my home. Home. Silas laughed, a dry, cruel sound. This is a hole in the dirt for a discarded Omega. You're an invasive pest on pack-sanctioned land now. We start digging at noon. Pack your rags and get out. Kelia sauntered forward, her eyes landing on the small ceramic jar I was still clutching. Before I could pull away, she snatched it from my hands. What's this? Still clinging to the dirt of the south? How pathetic. She tipped the jar over. The dried primrose fluttered out, landing on the pristine snow. Before I could reach for it, Silas stepped forward. He looked me dead in the eye, the man I once thought would be my mate, and brought his heavy leather boot down on the flower. He ground his heel into the snow, crushing the fragile petals into a muddy, unrecognizable smudge. The Frost-Bight belongs to the strong now, Elara, Silas sneered, his face inches from mine. And the strong don't have room for sentimental trash. Get out of my sight before I decide that exile wasn't a harsh enough punishment. I looked down at the ruined flower, the last thread of my past severed beneath his boot. I had nothing left, no pack, no home, and the stranger I had saved was a ghost of the night. I stood in the snow, surrounded by the laughter of the people who had destroyed me, waiting for the end. Silas reached for my arm, his fingers tightening like iron bands, ready to hurl me into the drifts. I won't tell you again, Elara. Move or be moved. But the air suddenly changed. The wind, which had been a chaotic scream, fell into a terrifying, pressurized silence. From the crest of the northern ridge, a wave of shadow began to spill downward. It wasn't the storm returning, it was the Blackguard. Dozens of warriors clad in obsidian-tinted armor, mounted on wolves so large they made the Summerpeak shifters look like pups, swept into the clearing. They moved with a terrifying, silent synchronization, forming a lethal perimeter that trapped Silas's construction crew and guards in a ring of cold steel. The laughter died in Kelia's throat. Silas froze, his hand still clamped onto my wrist, his face draining of color as he recognized the sigil of the twin eclipsed moons. The High Kingdom. The Alpha King's personal shadow. A path opened in the ranks of the armored guard. A man stepped forward, his presence so heavy it felt as though the very earth bowed beneath his boots. He wore no helmet, and his dark hair was windswept, but it was his eyes that stopped my heart. Silver blue. The color of a glacier's heart. The color of the eyes that had watched me from the floor of my cellar. Silas dropped my arm as if it had turned to white-hot coal. He fell back, stammering, "Your Majesty." Caspian. We did not expect the High Throne to survey such a desolate border. Caspian ignored him. He didn't even glance at the future Alpha of Summerpeak. He walked straight toward me, his gaze locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. He stopped just inches away, and for a moment, the only sound was the snapping of the Blackguard's banners in the wind. "You said you'd rather be weak and kind than strong and cruel," Caspian said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in my chest. My breath hitched. Those were my words. The confession I had whispered into the dark on the fifth night, when the fire was dying and I thought I was speaking to a beast that couldn't understand. "I spent 7 nights listening to you apologize for your heart," Caspian continued, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "I watched you offer your own life to keep a stranger from freezing. I disagree with your assessment, Elara. I think you are the strongest person I have ever met." "Your Majesty," Silas interrupted, his voice trembling with a desperate need to reclaim the narrative. "You don't understand. This woman, she was rejected. She is a nameless Omega, a failure of our pack. She is nothing." Caspian finally turned his head. The look he leveled at Silas was one of such pure, cold loathing that the younger Alpha actually stumbled back. She is not nothing, Caspian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She is the woman who pulled a silver harpoon from my shoulder while you were likely preening in your father's hall. She is the woman who shared her last scrap of warmth with a dying king without asking for his name or his crown. Caspian reached out, his hand hovering near my face, waiting for my permission. When I leaned into his touch, the world exploded. The moment his skin met mine, the mate bond, the true, goddess-blessed bond, snapped into place with the force of a supernova. It wasn't the dull, tepid connection I had felt with Silas. This was lightning and fire. It was the feeling of 1,000 shattered pieces of my soul suddenly being magnetized back into a single, unbreakable whole. A visible shockwave of silver light radiated from our touch, a physical manifestation of the bond that made even the blackguard bow their heads. Silas fell to his knees, his eyes wide with a sickening realization. He hadn't just rejected a weak Omega, he had rejected the predestined mate of the Alpha King. He had thrown away a queen. Kelia collapsed beside him, her face twisted in a mask of terror as she realized the cockroach she had mocked was now the highest authority in the land. Caspian looked down at them, his hand still cupping my cheek. "You trampled her flower," he said softly, looking at the muddy smudge in the snow. "You took her home. You called her a liability." He looked back at me, his expression softening into something so tender it made my eyes sting. "What shall we do with them, Elara? The crown is yours to wield." I looked at Silas, the man who had defined my worth by my utility, and then at Caspian, who saw my soul as a sanctuary. The revenge wasn't in a blade or a sentence. It was in the fact that I no longer cared what Silas thought of me. The look on Silas's face when he realized who he threw away, was that enough, or should the king have done more? Tell me what his punishment should be. I looked at Silas, shivering in the dirt. He was waiting for me to scream, to demand his head, to play the part of the vengeful victim. But as I stood there with Caspian's hand in mine, I realized that hate is just another way of staying connected to someone, and I wanted no part of him left in my soul. "I don't want their blood, Caspian," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the silent ranks of the blackguard. "And I don't want their apologies. I want them to be forgotten. Strip the summer peak of their claim to these ridges. Let them return to their golden hills and live with the knowledge of what they threw away. That is more than enough." Caspian nodded once, a silent command that his guards immediately began to execute, herding the stunned Summer Peak wolves back toward their border. He then turned back to me, the intensity of the mate bond humming between us like a living wire. He didn't pull me toward the carriage. Instead, he stepped back, giving me the space the world had always denied me. "I am a king, Elara," he said, his silver blue eyes searching mine. "But I will never be your master. I am here because you chose to save a nameless wolf in a storm. Now, I am asking you to choose the man. Will you leave this cold behind? Will you come with me and lead a kingdom that desperately needs your heart?" I looked at the stone cellar that had been my sanctuary and my prison. I looked at the muddy snow where my mother's flower had been crushed. For months, I thought I was surviving because I was hard enough to endure the frost. I was wrong. I survived because I was soft enough to care for a stranger when I had nothing left to give. My kindness hadn't been a defect. It had been the key that unlocked the heart of a king. "Yes," I whispered, reaching for his hand. "I'll go with you." Caspian lifted me into the velvet-lined warmth of the royal carriage. As we began the long journey south, I looked out the window one last time. The Frost-Bight was fading into a white haze, a ghost of a life I no longer recognized. I wasn't the rejected Omega anymore. I wasn't the girl who was too much or not enough. I was home, and for the first time in my life, home wasn't a place, it was the man sitting beside me, listening to every word I had to say. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay kind when the world is freezing you out. It takes a different kind of strength to keep your heart open when everyone tells you to lock it away. But as the snow falls on the Frost-Bight tonight, remember Elara. Remember that the world belongs to those brave enough to care. Thanks for watching until the end. It really helps the channel.